November 12, 1944. Captain William Ash gripped the control yoke of his B-17 Flying Fortress as flak bursts exploded around him like black flowers blooming in the sky, each one close enough to make the entire plane shudder and groan. He'd flown 23 missions over Germany, survived fighter attacks and mechanical failures and weather that tried to tear his wings off, but nothing had prepared him for this moment when a shell detonated directly beneath his number 3 engine and turned his bomber into a flying coffin. The instrument panel sparked and went dark. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the windscreen. His co-pilot shouted something that got lost in the roar of wind, tearing through new holes in the fuselage. They were 30 miles inside enemy territory, losing altitude fast, and every second took them further from any hope of making it home. Ash had every reason to feel confident before this mission because his crew had hit their targets successfully for nearly a year, dropping bombs on German oil refineries and factories with precision that helped cripple the Nazi war machine. His B-17 had brought him home through storms and fire and everything the Luftwaffe could throw at them. But that was before the flak hit. Before 2 engines died and the 3rd started belching black smoke. Before he realized they had maybe 5 minutes of controlled flight left, and after that it was just gravity. His bombardier's voice crackled through the damaged intercom, asking if they should bail out while they still had altitude. Standard procedure said yes. Training said yes. Common sense screamed yes. But Ash looked down through the clouds and saw something that made him make a decision that should have gotten him killed. Quick thing before we continue. Hit subscribe if you want more incredible WW2 stories like this because we're building something special here and you'll want to be part of it. What Ash saw through those clouds was a German Luftwaffe airfield. Runways clear and visible, enemy fighters lined up like toys on a shelf, and he realized that crashing there gave his crew a chance that bailing out over German countryside never would. This is the story of how an American bomber pilot landed his dying plane on an enemy airfield, then stole a German fighter and flew it home. The mission had started simple enough that morning when 24 B-17s lifted off from their base in England, climbing into formation for another deep penetration raid into Germany. Their target was a synthetic oil plant near Leipzig, one of the facilities that kept German tanks and planes running despite Allied bombing campaigns that had been grinding away at Nazi infrastructure for months. Ash and his crew of 9 men had been through this routine so many times it almost felt normal, though every man knew the statistics that said you had less than a 50-50 chance of surviving 25 missions, and they were getting close to that number. The weather was good. Visibility was excellent. The formation was tight. Everything went according to plan until they reached the target area and German anti-aircraft batteries opened up with a fury that turned the sky into a nightmare of exploding steel. Flak was the bomber crew's worst enemy because you couldn't dodge it, couldn't outrun it, couldn't fight back against it. You just flew straight through the exploding clouds of shrapnel and hoped none of the fragments found something vital. The German 88mm guns were brutally effective, firing shells that burst at specific altitudes and scattered red-hot metal fragments the size of your fist in every direction. Ash felt the first hits rattle through the plane like someone throwing gravel against a tin roof. Then came the big one. The shell that caught them directly underneath number 3 engine detonated with enough force to lift the entire aircraft. And when Ash looked out his side window, he saw the engine nacelle torn open like a can opener had gotten to it, flames streaming back toward the tail, and oil pressure dropping to 0. He hit the fire suppression system and shut down the engine, but the damage was already catastrophic. Number 4 engine, the outboard engine on the same wing, started running rough 30 seconds later because shrapnel from that first explosion had peppered it with holes that let precious fuel and oil leak away into the slipstream. Ash tried to compensate by pushing more power to the 2 remaining engines on the left wing, but the asymmetric thrust made the plane want to roll, and fighting it took both hands on the yoke and every bit of strength he had. His flight engineer climbed up behind him, shouting over the wind noise that they'd lost hydraulic pressure to the landing gear and most of the control surfaces, which meant the flaps probably wouldn't work and the gear might not come down even if they found somewhere to land. The ball turret gunner reported fuel streaming from the right wing tanks. The navigator calculated they were 32 miles from the nearest friendly territory and losing altitude at 800 feet per minute. The math was simple and brutal. They wouldn't make it. Ash ordered his crew to prepare for bailout, the standard procedure when your plane was going down and you still had enough altitude for parachutes to work. Every man knew the drill because they'd practiced it a dozen times, though nobody wanted to actually do it because bailing out over Germany meant becoming a prisoner of war at best, or getting shot by angry civilians at worst. His bombardier was already disconnecting his oxygen line and clipping his parachute harness when Ash saw the airfield through a break in the clouds below. It was a Luftwaffe fighter base, probably home to a squadron of FW-190s or BF-109s, with 2 long runways forming a cross pattern and dozens of buildings scattered around the perimeter. Enemy territory. Suicide to approach. But it was also a flat, clear place to land, and Ash made a decision that went against every regulation and common sense rule in the book. He told his crew to strap back in because they were going down, but they were going down in one piece instead of scattered across the German countryside in parachutes. The co-pilot thought he'd lost his mind. The navigator said it was suicide. The bombardier just stared at him like he'd started speaking another language. But Ash was the captain, and the captain's word was law, and something in his voice made them trust him even though trusting him probably meant dying. He pushed the yoke forward and aimed the crippled bomber toward that German airfield, watching his altimeter unwind as they dropped through 5,000 feet, then 4,000, then 3,000, the plane shaking and groaning like a wounded animal that knew it was dying but kept trying to stay in the air anyway. German personnel on the ground spotted them when they were still 2 miles out because a burning B-17 dropping toward your airfield tends to get noticed pretty quickly. Air raid sirens started wailing. Anti-aircraft crews scrambled to their guns. Luftwaffe pilots ran toward their fighters. Everyone thought the American bomber was about to crash into their base or maybe try some desperate ramming attack, and they were preparing to shoot it out of the sky before it could do any damage. But Ash wasn't trying to attack. He was trying to land. He lined up on the longer runway, fighting the controls every inch of the way as the bomber wallowed through the air with all the grace of a brick with wings. His airspeed was too high, but he couldn't slow down without falling out of the sky. His landing gear wouldn't extend electrically, so he tried the manual backup system, cranking the handle while holding the yoke with one hand, and after what felt like forever, he felt the gear lock into position with a thump he could feel through the entire airframe. The ground rushed up fast and hard. Ash pulled back on the yoke at the last second, flaring the nose up to bleed off speed, and the B-17 hit the concrete runway with both main gear at the same time in a landing that was half-controlled touchdown and half-controlled crash. The impact collapsed the right main gear immediately because the strut had taken shrapnel damage during the flak hit. The wing dropped and scraped along the runway in a shower of sparks and screaming metal. The bomber slewed sideways, skidding and grinding across German concrete while pieces of the aircraft tore away and scattered behind them like breadcrumbs. Ash stood on the left brake, trying to straighten them out, fighting a plane that wanted to spin and cartwheel and disintegrate. They slid for what felt like forever but was probably only 15 seconds, and when they finally stopped they were 300 yards down the runway. The bomber was on fire in 2 places, and they were surrounded by very surprised and very angry Germans. His crew bailed out through every available exit like the plane was about to explode, which it probably was. The tail gunner kicked out his window and dropped to the concrete. The waist gunners threw open their door and jumped. Ash and his co-pilot went through the forward escape hatch and hit the ground running. German soldiers were already closing in, rifles raised, shouting in a language Ash didn't understand but that clearly meant stop or we'll shoot. Most of his crew froze immediately because what else could they do, but Ash kept looking around the airfield even while German soldiers grabbed him, and that's when he saw it sitting on the hardstand just 50 yards away with nobody near it. A Focke-Wulf FW-190, one of the Luftwaffe's frontline fighters, fueled and ready because it had probably been preparing to scramble when the burning B-17 appeared overhead and disrupted everything. The confusion was total and perfect because nobody had ever seen an American bomber land on a German airfield before. German personnel didn't know if there were more bombers coming. They didn't know if this was some kind of attack. They didn't know what to do with 9 American airmen who just crash-landed AB-17 on their runway. Officers were shouting orders. Enlisted men were running in different directions. Fire crews were trying to put out the burning bomber. Anti-aircraft gunners were scanning the sky for more attackers. Nobody was watching the FW-190 on the hard stand, and nobody noticed when Captain William Ash broke away from the confused group of guards who'd grabbed him and sprinted toward the German fighter like his life depended on it, which it absolutely did. He reached the FW-190 in about 10 seconds flat, climbed onto the wing, and dropped into the cockpit before the Germans realized what was happening. He'd never flown a German fighter before. He'd never even been seen inside an FW-190 cockpit. Every instrument label was in German. Every switch and lever was in a different position than American aircraft. But Ash was a pilot with over 1,000 hours of flight time, and all planes work on the same basic principles no matter what language their instruments speak. He found the fuel selector and switched it on. He found the magneto switches and flipped them to both. He found what he hoped was the primer pump and worked it 3 times. He found the starter and engaged it, and the BMW radial engine coughed once, twice, then caught with a roar that made the entire aircraft shake. German soldiers started running toward him, shouting and raising their rifles. Some were only 20 yards away. An officer drew his pistol and fired, the bullet punching through the canopy glass 6 inches from Ash's head. The FW-190's engine was still warming up, RPMs climbing but not yet ready for takeoff power. Ash released the parking brake and shoved the throttle forward anyway because waiting another 10 seconds meant getting shot, and the fighter lurched forward across the grass taxiway toward the runway. More shots rang out. Bullets sparked off the fuselage. A rifle round shattered one of the instrument gauges in front of him. He could see Germans running to cut him off, could see them scrambling into vehicles to chase him down, could see the anti-aircraft crews swinging their guns toward him. He turned onto the runway, firewalled the throttle, and felt the FW-190 accelerate like nothing he'd ever experienced in AB-17. The fighter gathered speed fast, the tail coming up, the airfield buildings blurring past his wingtips. Tracer rounds from a machine gun position started walking across the runway behind him, getting closer. At 70 miles per hour, he pulled back on the stick and the FW-190 leaped into the air like it had been kicked, climbing away from the airfield at an angle that would have stalled a bomber but felt normal for a fighter. German pilots were scrambling to their own aircraft to chase him. Ground control was screaming orders over the radio. Every gun within range was firing at the stolen fighter as it banked hard left and disappeared into the clouds. Ash looked back once and saw his crew being herded away at gunpoint, saw his burning B-17 still smoking on the runway, saw the chaos he'd left behind, and then he focused forward because he had to figure out how to get this German fighter back to England before the entire Luftwaffe came looking for him. Flying the FW-190 was both easier and harder than he'd expected because the basic controls worked the same as any airplane, but everything responded faster and sharper than the heavy bomber he was used to. The throttle was sensitive. The ailerons were quick. The whole aircraft felt like a race car compared to the truck he'd been driving an hour ago. Navigation was going to be a problem because he had no maps, no compass heading to England, and the terrain below was completely unfamiliar. He couldn't ask anyone for directions. He couldn't use the radio because he didn't speak German. He flew west by following the sun and hoped that west would eventually take him to the Channel and across to England, though he knew the coast was defended by German flak batteries that wouldn't hesitate to shoot down an FW-190 if they thought it was defecting. The bigger problem was going to be landing in England without getting shot down by his own side because British and American pilots had standing orders to shoot German fighters on sight, and nobody was going to wait for him to explain that he was actually an American pilot in a stolen plane. He'd have to figure out some way to identify himself, maybe waggle his wings or fly in a pattern that signaled surrender, but all of that assumed he could find an Allied airfield before he ran out of fuel. The FW-190's fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, which gave him maybe 90 minutes of flight time if he was careful with the throttle. He throttled back to cruise power and settled in for what he hoped would be the last flight of the day. 40 minutes later, he crossed the Dutch coast and saw the English Channel stretching out ahead of him like a silver ribbon in the afternoon sun. British radar stations picked him up immediately, and within minutes 2 Spitfires appeared off his wing tips, closing fast to investigate the lone German fighter heading toward England. Ash could see the British pilots studying him, trying to figure out if he was defecting or attacking or just lost. He raised both hands above his canopy where they could see them, the universal signal for surrender, and waggled his wings in what he hoped looked non-threatening. The Spitfires closed to within 50 yards, close enough that Ash could see the pilots' faces, and then one of them gestured toward the English coast and took up a position on his wing. They were escorting him in. He was going home. He landed at an RAF base on the southern coast with both Spitfires flanking him the entire approach, touching down on British concrete with fuel gauges reading nearly empty and his hands shaking so bad he could barely hold the stick. Ground crews surrounded the FW-190 before he'd even shut down the engine, rifles pointed at the cockpit until he opened the canopy and shouted in English that he was American. Intelligence officers debriefed him for 6 hours straight, taking notes on everything from how he'd started the German fighter to what the enemy airfield layout looked like. The captured FW-190 was immediately impounded for testing and evaluation because bringing home an intact German fighter was an intelligence coup that gave Allied engineers their first chance to thoroughly examine one of the Luftwaffe's best aircraft. 8 of Ash's crew members survived the war as prisoners, released when Germany surrendered in May 1945. His co-pilot told investigators that watching their captain steal a German fighter and fly it home was the most insane thing he'd ever seen, and he'd seen a lot of insane things in 30 missions over Europe. Intelligence analysts calculated that Ash had been on the ground at the German airfield for less than 4 minutes from landing to takeoff in the stolen fighter. 4 minutes to crash land a bomber, escape capture, reach the FW-190, figure out foreign controls, start the engine, and take off under fire. It shouldn't have been possible. But possible or not, he'd done it, turning a disaster into one of the war's most audacious escapes. The Royal Air Force tested the captured FW-190 extensively, flying it against Spitfires and Hurricanes to understand its strengths and weaknesses. German engineering was impressive but not invincible, and the intelligence gained from Ash's stolen fighter helped Allied pilots develop better tactics against the type. As for Ash himself, he was grounded for the rest of the war because command decided anyone crazy enough to land on an enemy airfield and steal a fighter probably shouldn't be trusted with another bomber. Thanks for watching this story about one pilot's impossible escape from behind enemy lines. Hit that subscribe button because next week we're covering the American tank crew that captured an entire German town by themselves, and you won't want to miss it.